Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Today, inshallah, we are going to complete chapter 4 and start in chapter 5. The last point in chapter 4, which is the multiplier. Multiplier means al-mudha'if. To understand the idea of multiplier, let's take the following example in order to understand the concept of the multiplier, right? Before going to the definition, suppose that the business sector decided to increase its investment, increasing of investment. What are the main effects of increasing investment on the aggregate output? Positive, would increase. So increasing of investment leads to increasing of the aggregate output. The increasing of outputs leads to what? Leads to increasing of the demand for workers, right? Or employment. So this leads to increasing of employment. Then, what would happen? Increasing of employment leads to what? Increasing of income. Aggregate income. Income. If the income increased, the consumption would increase. Consumption. And as you know that the consumption or the increasing of consumption is part of the increasing of income, صح? By the MBC. يعني suppose إنه MBC equals 70% and increasing by $100 of income leads to increasing by $70 in consumption, right? صح ولا لا؟ مظبوط ولا مش مظبوط؟ The increasing consumption, as you know that aggregate expenditure equals C plus I, right? Increasing consumption leads to what? Increasing aggregate demand or aggregate expenditure. صح? So the increasing consumption, as you know, leads to what? To increasing of aggregate expenditure, which means increasing of aggregate demand for goods and services. What would happen? The output would increase. This leads to increasing of aggregate output once again. صح? Increasing of aggregate output leads to what? The same cycle. Increasing of aggregate income. Which leads to what? Increasing of consumption once again. Aggregate consumption. Then increasing aggregate expenditure or aggregate demand. So, as you see, we have what? A multiplier increasing in aggregate output and increasing in income. So if the government or the business sector decided to invest in $100 million, this leads to what? In the first case, the aggregate output would increase by $100 million. This is an increasing an investment by $100 million leads to, in the first time, the aggregate output would increase by $100 million, right? And then, this leads to increasing employment, then increasing of aggregate expenditure or aggregate income, which leads to increasing consumption, and then finally increasing of output once again. Maybe it should increase by 70, it depends, right? So here we have increasing, the first case, the aggregate output increased by 100. In the second case, may be increased by 70%, $70 million. It depends on what? It depends on the increasing of consumption. هلا الزيادة اللي صارت هنا where here we have increasing by $100 million في الاوتبوت صح؟ زودت الانكم ب 100 مليون $100 صح؟ اللي وصلوا ل 100 مليون $100 مليون راح عامل consumption بمقدار الام بي سي صح؟ لأنه جزء part of this increasing in income goes to what? To consumption. Suppose that MBC equals 70%. فرايح ايش مساوي؟ ماخذ 70% $70 مليون عامل فيهم purchasing صح؟ اللي هو 70% times 100 اللي هو increasing في الانكم صار في عنده consumption ب 70 مليون. فراح in this case في عندنا increasing في الاوتبوت ب 70 وبالتالي additional increasing in income ب 70 مليون. كمان هذا وداني وين؟ The same cycle. So I expect that, or the summation in this case of increasing in aggregate output or aggregate income equals what? 100 million plus 70 million plus, it depends on the, it's called the multiplier. Multiplier means مضاعفات. So suppose if or the business sector decided to invest or to increase its investment, the planned investment by $100 million, we expect that the increasing of aggregate output would increase with a larger amount of $100 million. صح؟ يعني لو زودوا الاستثمار بمليون دولار $100 million, الاوتبوت بزيدش ب $100 million, would increase with a larger amount because it's a cycle, or it's called the multiplier, means مضاعفات. صارت فيها مضاعفات ب 100 ب 70 and so on. The summation of these, and it will stop by the end. At the end it will reach to the zero, لأنه عماله قاعد بيتناقص هذا من 100 ل 70. ال 70 هذول بده يصير في عندهم consumption مظبوط ب 75%. So the additional, or at the last or the third stage بصير شو الوضع؟ 70% اللي هو الام بي سي times 70 مليون $. قديش بصير في additional increasing؟ 49. بعدين ال 49 في الستيج اللي بعده بتصير ايش؟ بتضربها ب 70%. So it's as you see we have the summation or the total increasing in output would be larger or greater than the increasing of aggregate investment or the planned investment. واضحة صورة المultiplier? So let's come back to the definition as you see. The multiplier is the ratio of the change in equilibrium level of output as or due to change of some of or in some autonomous or independent variables, which are اللي هو planned investment والgovernment spending وخلاص. That's it. يعني these are two major factors اللي هم autonomous بسموه. Let's go to the formula to understand the concept once again. The multiplier. So in this case, or this example that we have studied now, we assume that the investment, the planned investment increased by $100. This is increasing of I by $100 million. And what should happen to aggregate output? It would increase. By how much? No, with a larger amount. But by how much? This is the question. So the multiplier, it's called, in this case, it's called the investment multiplier. مضاعف الاستثمار, which equals what? Delta Y over delta I. This means the percentage change in Y is due to that change in the planned investment in this case. تمام؟ يعني suppose إنه investment increased by $100 million. How much is the change in aggregate output? This is the concept of the investment multiplier, right? Which equals 1 over 1 minus MBC. It's a formula. لأنه الزيادات والمضاعفات اللي صارت بناء على الام بي سي في السكند والثيرد ستيج and so on. صح؟ So the formula for the investment multiplier is delta y over delta I equals 1 over 1 minus MBC. So, sorry? 1, yes, 1 over MBS. Right? So suppose that the government or the business sector decided to invest or to increase its investment by $100 million. So increasing of I by $100 million, right? Which is delta I equals positive $100 million. If MBC equals 0.700. Calculate the increase or the change in aggregate output. So the question is, or the formula, the information told us or said that if the business sector or the planned investment increased by $100 million, by the end, what are the consequences and effects of this policy on the aggregate output? What are the main effects of increasing investment by $100 million on the aggregate output if the marginal propensity to consume for this community is 0.70? So as you see, delta y over delta I in this case is positive 100 equals 1 over 1 minus MBC 0.70. So delta y over 100 equals 1 over 0.30. Right? So delta y times 0.30, delta y equals 100 times 1. صح؟ 100 times 1. So what should happen? Delta y equals 100 times 1, 100 over 0.30. So delta y equals how much? 333.3. This means what? The change or the increasing in investment or the planned investment by $100 million leads to what? To increase in aggregate output or aggregate income by $333.3 million, right? By the end. If the the MBC equals 0.7. So as you see, the multiplier is sensitive to what? To the value of autonomous and the value of marginal propensity to consume or marginal propensity to save. صح؟ مظبوط يا شباب؟ The same idea if the government decided to increase its spending by $100 million. And suppose that the government decided to increase its spending by $100 million and the MBC equals 0.70. We have the government spending multiplier. It's called the government spending multiplier, مضاعف الإنفاق الحكومي. It has the same effect of the investment multiplier. But it's called what? The government spending multiplier. So it has the same effect. It's called امسح هذا ولا اوكي خلي اكتبه. الفكرة واضحة يا شباب ولا في اشياء باقي وسع السنة؟ اعيد اشي اعيد مين مش واضح له اعيد له؟ محمد يس مش واضح حاضر حعيد. الكونسبت تبع المالتيبلاير واصلك الفكرة؟ اوكي. Suppose that the business sector decided to increase its spending in the economy by $100 million, right? As we mentioned that increasing of investment leads to what? Increasing of aggregate output. Increasing of aggregate output leads to increasing employment, right? Increasing of employment leads to increasing of income, our aggregate income. Part of this income, suppose it increased by $100 million. So at the first stage, we invested or increased our investment by the planned investment by $100 million. The first stage, the increasing of aggregate income is $100 million. صح? Part of this income goes for consumption as with the value of MBC. على جزء من الدخل هذا بيروح على الاستهلاك بمقدار MBC. So in the second stage قديش صارت في عندي زيادة؟ Suppose إنه MBC is 0.70 70 times 0.70 times 100 million اللي هو في الكونسومشن قديش صار في عندي increasing في الكونسومشن 70 in the first stage كان 100. This is increasing consumption or income. رحنا مخدين 70% منه على الكونسومشن بمقدار MBC اللي هو 0.70. right? امسح هذا عشان اوضح له ها. اوكي اوضحها هنا بشكل So as you see, Muhammad, increasing and the planned investment by $100 million in the first stage leads to what? Increasing of income by the same amount or output or aggregate output by the same amount, $100 million. تمام? Part of this income goes for consumption by or with a value of marginal propensity to consume. هلا لو كان عندي MBC if MBC equals 0.70 and 70%, this means that 70% of the additional income or increasing goes for consumption. So it's equals to what? We have increasing in consumption by 0.70 times 100. 70% times 100 equals $70 million. هذا في الستيج هذا. طيب, the increasing of consumption leads to what? It would increase the aggregate expenditure because the consumption is part of aggregate expenditure. But increasing of aggregate expenditure leads to means increasing of aggregate demand for goods. صح? This leads to what? Increasing in employment. كمان this leads to increase of income. صح؟ بالمقدار ايش؟ 70. هلا 70 هذا $1 million. كمان part of this income will go to the consumption by 70 by MBC times the increasing of income. 0.70 times 70. This is the increasing of consumption. ويساوي for and so on. So it's a multiplier here. So as you see, the increasing of $1 million in investment leads to increasing increasing in income or aggregate output. صح? In the first stage, 100 million and then 70 million plus and so to reach the zero in the final stage. آخر حاجة بيضل يتناقص لحد ما يوصل الصفر. So in the final, the question is, suppose that the increasing of investment is $100 million and the MBC equals 0.70, calculate the change in aggregate output in the final stage. This is the idea. This is the concept of multiplier. As I mentioned that the investment multiplier equals what? Delta Y over delta I, which means how much is the change in Y when investment or the planned investment increased by $1. We have a formula to calculate the change in Y. هلا دخلنا الزيادات هذه صارت نتيجة ايش؟ انه في changes في الام بي سي او it depends on the marginal propensity to consume. We have the formula which is delta Y over delta I equals 1 over 1 minus MBC. It's a formula. So, in this case, calculate the change of Y, or aggregate output in the final stage. It equals what? Here we have increasing by $100 million. It's unknown. 1 over 1 minus, and you see, and we calculate it. So the delta Y equals how much حسبناها? 3.3. This means what? If the business sector invested in $100 million, or increasing in the planned investment by $100 million, the final result would be increasing in the aggregate output by 333, right? The same idea for the government spending multiplier. It has the same concept, the same idea. Suppose that the government decided to increase its spending, not the business sector. The government decided to increase its spending. As you know, the government spending, or increasing the government spendings, leads to what? Increase of aggregate output, right? So it has the same effect. Suppose that the government decided to increase its spending, or increasing the government spending, G, by $100 million. This leads to increasing to what? Increasing the aggregate demand for goods. صح؟ مظبوط? This leads to increasing aggregate demand for goods, and which means increasing of aggregate expenditure, and then the aggregate output would increase. The same employment, increasing income, and so increasing of consumption by the value of MBC. The same concept, the same result. And we have the same formula. In the first case, we talk about the investment multiplier, but now we are talking about the government spending multiplier. It's called the government spending multiplier. The government spending multiplier, it's called the government spending multiplier, equals what? Delta Y over delta G instead of I, equals 1 over 1 minus MBC. That's it. So if the government decided to increase its spending by $50 million, this is the increasing of the government spending, or delta G. This leads to what? And MBC, suppose that MBC equals 0.30 or 25 or 55. The question is, calculate the change and the aggregate output. So we have to use the same formula. Delta Y is unknown over delta G. It's a positive. Increasing in G, 50, equals 1 over 1 minus 0.55. The same idea. And we have to calculate the change in Y. It should be larger than or greater than the first increasing, or the increasing in the government spending. اعملوا الكالكوليشن بتلاقيها delta Y is larger than delta G. Right? واضحة ولا مش واضحة؟ Okay. Sorry? Okay. As you see, delta Y times 1 minus 0.55, 45 times 45 equals how much? 50. 50 times 1, 50. So delta Y equals 50 over 0.45. حدا يعمل calculations هيك. Delta Y 50 over 0.45 equals how much? حدا نطلعها بس. So delta Y equals 100. Okay, 111. So as you see, in this case, the government increased its spending by $50 million. The result would be increasing in Y by 111. 11 right. وضحت الصورة. So let's go to so as you see, the size of multiplier depends on the slope of a planned aggregate expenditure line اللي هو MBC. So it depends on the MBC, the marginal propensity to consume. In this example, as you see, we have the following figure. This line, which starts from 125, is the aggregate expenditure 1, which is C plus I function, right? The question is, or suppose that the business sector decided to increase its investment by 25. Delta I equals 25. How much is the change in Y? So as you see, in the first stage, or the first case, this is Y. The equilibrium output, the equilibrium aggregate output was how much? At A, $500 million, right? والMBC عندنا قديش؟ Let's calculate the MBC. Equals 500 minus اعملوا لي 500 ناقص 125. Let's calculate the MBC in this case. MBC in this case, delta C over delta Y equals how much? Or delta aggregate expenditure over delta Y. In this case, 500 minus 125 over 500 minus 0 equals how much? 375 over 500. How much? قديش عملوها الآلة؟ حد عمل يا 0.75, right? And where is the previous or the initial equilibrium? At point A, right? At this case, or in this case, the aggregate output is 500, right? Now, suppose that the business sector, or we would like to increase the planned investment by $25 million. Delta I increased by, or we have a change, increasing an investment by $25 million. شو اللي صار? We have increasing in the aggregate expenditure function, صح؟ بمقدار ال 25. So شو اللي صار عندي هنا؟ Aggregate expenditure 2, we have this line. هذا aggregate expenditure 2 equals C plus I plus increasing in I. صح؟ So what do you see? We have a new equilibrium point, which is, or when Y equals aggregate expenditure 2. لأنه صار في عندنا ارتفاع بقيمة الفانكشن من 125 ل 150, which is the value of autonomous investment. صح؟ So from 125 to 150, and we have the same slope, right? So what do you see? We would like to calculate the change in aggregate output. As we mentioned that the multiplier or investment multiplier equals delta Y over delta I equals 1 over 1 minus MBC. So delta Y over, we have increasing in I, an investment by $25 million. So 25 equals 1 over 1 minus 0.75. Right? So delta Y over 25 equals 100 over 0.25. ضرب تبادلي. So in this case, 0.25 times delta y equals 25. So delta y equals how much? 100? Okay. This means if the government or the business sector decided to increase its investment by, the planned investment by $25 million, the aggregate output would increase by how much? 100 million. So in the first case, the initial equilibrium point was how much? $500 million. The increasing of aggregate investment leads to, or the planned investment leads to increasing of Y by $100 million. So it has become how much? 600 million, from 500 to 600. So we have additional increasing N, the aggregate output by $100 million. صح؟ مظبوط ولا لا؟ طيب suppose إنه we have additional increasing N, the planned investment by $100 million. يعني كنا هيك, and we have additional increasing by $100 million. How much is the new equilibrium Y? The increasing by of the planned investment by $100 million هيزيد من وين لوين؟ من 150 ل 250. Right? صح ولا لا? So we have an increasing or additional increasing. أمسحها. And MBC is the same. So we have additional increasing and the planned investment by how much? 100. Calculate the new equilibrium output. So in this case, delta y over delta I, 100, equals 1 over 1 minus MBC, which is 0.75. So delta y equals, أعطوا الشغلنا هيك, 100 over 25, 0.25 equals 400. So we have additional increasing in y by 400. قديش صار؟ حيروح على 1000. Because from 600 to yes, we can add 400, we will reach to 1000. So this is the new equilibrium. Right? Okay? طيب if the MBC increased, and suppose that the business sector decided to increase its spending by $100 million, and the marginal propensity to consume increased from 0.75 to 0.80. What would happen to the aggregate output? We will see. So suppose, or our assumption is delta I equals 100 positive, and MBC, the marginal propensity to consume, increased from 0.75 to 0.80. Calculate the change in the aggregate output. So delta y over 100 million equals 1 over 1 minus 0.80. صح? So delta y times 0.20 equals 100. So delta y equals 100 over 0.20 equals $500 million. Right? So this means if the MBC increased, the aggregate output would increase. صح؟ هذا شو معناه؟ إنه كل ما زاد المارجنال propensity to consume تبع الناس في المراحل المتقدمة عمليا الاجريجيت اوت بتزيد. صح؟ مش هيك معناه؟ ولا لا؟ So here, as you see, the size of multiplier in the United States is 1.4. This means increasing in investment by 1 billion leads to increasing of aggregate output by 0.4. Let's go to the relationship between the saving or aggregate saving and aggregate output. The relationship between aggregate saving and aggregate output. Is it positive or negative? Suppose that the households decided to increase their saving. This leads to what? Exactly, and the aggregate output would decline. So there is a negative relationship between the aggregate saving and the aggregate output, because as you know that the income, the aggregate income, is divided into two parts: saving and consumption. Right? So if the households decided to save more, the consumption would decline. So this leads to a reduction in consumption. A decreasing in consumption leads to what? To a decreasing in aggregate demand. So the aggregate output would decline. And then the aggregate income would decline by the value of what? Of MPC as well. بنفس الآلية بس inverse relationship. صح? So as you see here, the households decided to increase their saving by $50 million. هلا الطلوع من سالب 100 لسالب 50 زيادة في السيفنج، صح؟ مش انخفاض في السيفنج، لأنه لو كنا هنا عند 50 وطلعنا ل 100 increasing في السيفنج. So as you see in the first case, S equals I, the saving at equilibrium, saving equals investment, at Y, $500 million. If the households, or when the households decided to increase their saving, we have a new equilibrium point, point B. In this case, the aggregate output declined by $300 million, or by 200, from 500 million to $300 million. Why? The value of what? The MBC. صح؟ مظبوط ولا لا؟ Who has any problem so far? Yes. حاضر. As I mentioned that there is an inverse relationship between the aggregate saving and the aggregate output. Increasing of saving means decreasing in the consumption, which means a reduction in aggregate demand, then the aggregate output, the aggregate income, and so on. So we have an inverse relationship between the aggregate saving and aggregate output. For the last case, in the first case, the initial or the original equilibrium point is A, when there is an intersection between the saving and investment, right? Now, suppose that the household sector decided to increase their saving, which means there is a backward shifting of the saving function. So we have a new equilibrium point when the new saving intersect the investment, the planned investment line. So we have a new aggregate output, which is $300 million, right? That's it. طيب. So as you see, the increasing of saving in this case, increasing of saving by $50 million leads to what? A decreasing in our aggregate output by how much? 200 million. صح؟ مظبوط؟ لأنه من 500 ل 300 200 million or $1 billion. تمام؟ صعب الأمور ولا؟ Okay. Which is the government fiscal policy? Or the government and fiscal policy. In this chapter, we will focus on the government fiscal policy, or the fiscal policy that used by the government in order to stimulate the economy. As we mentioned in the chapter 1, when we talk about the fiscal policy, we are talking about two things. The government spending, fiscal policy. Exactly. We are talking about the government spending, G, and the government taxes, G and T. Some schools of the economy talks about, or like the Keynesian school, talks about the importance of the government to do an intervention in the economy to stimulate it or to get rid of unemployment. It should necessary to do an intervention by the government to stimulate the economy. But some schools or other schools talk about that there is no need for the government intervention, like who's the classical economists, right? But in general, the government intervention by using different policies, fiscal and monetary policy, is very important in order to solve the different problems in the economy, right? So suppose that we have a high unemployment rate, the government should stimulate it by using an expansionary fiscal policy. If we have high inflation rate, it should decline or decrease the government spending, and vice versa for the taxes, right? In this chapter, we will study the government spending multiplier, and we will add something related to the aggregate expenditure function. In the previous chapter, we said that the aggregate expenditure equals what? C plus I, right? And the equilibrium occurs when Y equals aggregate expenditure. In this chapter, we will assume, or we will add the government as a part of the spending. So it should be, or the aggregate expenditure will be C plus I plus G, right? So in this case, Y should equal C plus I plus G. This is the first part, right? Okay.